By the fall of 1847, the United States had won its war with Mexico. It simply could not end it. General Winfield Scott had done the near impossible, landed at Veracruz, fought up into the mountains, and taken Mexico City itself. On paper, the war was over. But behind his victorious army stretched a lifeline, 260 miles of road back to the sea, and every mile of it was bleeding. Ambushed columns, burned supply trains, couriers who rode out and never arrived. The conventional war was won. A guerrilla war had taken its place, and it was strangling the winners. Understand the scale of it. Scott had perhaps 24,000 men to hold a conquered nation, and his entire war hung on a single thread of road from the capital to the sea. Cut that thread often enough, and the army in Mexico City would simply wither. The guerrillas knew it. That was the whole strategy. Washington needed a particular kind of soldier for that fight. Ruthless, mobile, at home in an ugly, no-quarter war with no front line and no rules. It knew exactly where to look. It called for the Texans, and it called for Jack Hays. Welcome back to the Western Ledger. I'm Lamar. Today, the last and darkest chapter of Jack Hays' war, the guerrilla fight on the road to Mexico City, the gun that finally arrived, and the reputation that would outlive every man who earned it. When Monterey ended a year before, Hays' first regiment had simply dissolved, enlistments up, men gone home. But the war had not waited for them. It had moved south with Scott, and it had gotten dirtier. In the summer of 1847, the War Department authorized Texas to raise a fresh regiment of mounted volunteers for 12 months and for the duration of the war. There was only one obvious man to command it. Jack Hays, now a full colonel, the most famous fighting captain the Texas frontier had ever produced. On August 12, 1847, his new regiment rode out of San Antonio, bound for Veracruz, under orders to clear the guerrillas from the road to the interior. Among them rode a young officer named John Salmon Ford, Rip Ford, who would leave one of the finest accounts we have of everything that followed. And this time, some of them carried something new. Remember Samuel Walker, the ranger who took a Comanche lance clean through the body at Walker's Creek and lived? Walker had gone east, and he had done something about the weapon that saved his life. He sat down with Samuel Colt himself. Colt, still broke and factoryless when we last saw him, and told him how to build a better revolver. Bigger, heavier, a sixth shot in the cylinder. In a letter, Walker told Colt exactly what the frontier wanted. With improvements, I think they can be rendered the most perfect weapon in the world for light-mounted troops. The result was a monster of a handgun, 4.5 pounds, over 15 inches long, a .44 that hit like a rifle. They called it the Colt Walker. And in October of 1847, the first of them were issued to Jack Hays' regiment. The gun that a fight on a Texas creek had inspired 7 years before had finally become real, just in time for the ugliest fighting of Hays' life. And there is a small, strange justice in that gun. Samuel Colt, who had gone bankrupt because almost nobody would buy his revolver, won the government contract for the Walkers, and it put him back in business for good. The frontier that believed in his pistol when no one else did had just made his fortune. But that is a happier story than the one waiting up the road. The war Hays rode into in the fall of 1847 was nothing like Monterey. There were no fortified cities to storm, no set-piece battles. There was a road and the men who lived along it, and the two could not be told apart. Mexican guerrillas, some regular cavalry, some patriots, some simple bandits, and most of them all three by turns, struck the American supply columns and vanished into villages that sheltered them. Fighting leaders like the guerrilla priest Padre Girota became heroes of the resistance. And the American answer, more and more, was collective punishment. If a village hid the men who killed your soldiers, you burned the village. It was a war without mercy on either side, and it was exactly the war the Texans had been raised in. For a decade, Hayes's men had fought an enemy who raided and vanished, who gave no quarter and expected none, on ground where the line between fighter and civilian was never clean. The Comanche Wars had been, in their way, a long apprenticeship in exactly this kind of fighting. Now the Texans brought that apprenticeship to central Mexico and applied it without hesitation and often without restraint. Hayes reached Puebla and threw his regiment in with a hard-driving brigade under General Joseph Lane, and together they became Scott's dedicated hunters, a task force sent to break the insurgency by whatever means it took. Lane, writing to Scott afterward, did not stint on Hayes. Never did any officer act with more gallantry than Colonel Hayes in this affair. And for a few months, it worked with terrible efficiency. Hayes and Lane ran the guerrilla bands ragged, broke up their concentrations, and pried the insurgency loose from the road. The killing went both ways, and neither side kept an honest ledger of it. But the road took its own from them, too. At the town of Huamantla in October, the Rangers' old comrade Samuel Walker, the man whose name was stamped on those new revolvers, led a charge and was shot dead, two of his own Walker Colts in his hands. The gun outlived the man who designed it by a matter of weeks, and Walker's men did what these men always did when they lost one of their own. In revenge for his death, the American volunteers tore Huamantla apart, looting, burning, killing, in a spree so ugly that one U.S. officer wrote it was then he finally understood how much harm men beyond all discipline could do. The vengeance that had ridden south out of Texas was feeding on itself now, and it was about to reach a city of 200,000 people. On December 6, 1847, Jack Hayes led his Rangers into occupied Mexico City. The capital had fallen to Scott 3 months earlier, and its people had made an uneasy peace with the American garrison, soldiers who, on the whole, kept order. But the city had heard the stories out of the north and the coast, and now the stories arrived in the flesh. Rip Ford remembered the crowds. Mexican citizens thronged the streets to watch them pass. These were the Diablos Tejanos, the Texas Devils, and the whole capital turned out in a kind of horrified fascination just to look at them. They had reason to be afraid. At the job Scott actually needed, hunting the guerrillas who still worked the edges of the city, the Rangers were, by every account, superb. Scott himself called Hayes and his men invaluable. But inside the city, off the leash, those same men were something the United States Army could barely hold. It was not exactly that Hayes lost control of his men. By the accounts, he kept a tighter rein than most and drove them hard at the actual enemy. It was that the war itself had no brakes. Every man in that regiment carried a private list of scores, and a conquered city full of the people he blamed for them was a dangerous place to turn such men loose. The breaking point came when a ranger named Adam Alsons rode into a rough quarter of the capital, was set upon, and was killed, his body badly mutilated. The ranger's answer was not an arrest, it was a reckoning. Over the night that followed, they moved through that quarter and killed, by the sober estimates, dozens of Mexican men in open, deliberate reprisal. American officers were horrified.
The killing stopped only when the army stepped in. We have to be honest about what these men were, because the record is honest about it. One of Hayes's own close associates described the Mexicans they fought as a depraved and unprincipled people, the kind of contempt that lets decent men do indecent things and sleep afterward. General Scott prized the Rangers' results. His own officers laid the worst atrocities of the entire Central Campaign, specifically at the feet of Hayes's Texans. Both of those things are true at once. They were the most effective counter-guerrilla force in Mexico, and they were at times simply murderers. Los Diablos Tejanos was not a compliment, and it was not a slander. It was an accurate description, earned in full in the streets of a conquered city. The war did not last much longer. On February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended it. Mexico gave up its claim to Texas at last and ceded something almost beyond imagining besides: California and the vast Southwest, more than 500,000 square miles. The map of the continent was redrawn in a single stroke, and Jack Hayes had helped hold the knife. It is worth stopping on that. The men who spent the 1830s fighting to keep Texas out of Mexico's hands had, by the end of the 1840s, helped take a third of Mexico for the United States. The same revolver, the same riders, the same fury, turned from defense to conquest inside a single decade. Whatever else you make of Jack Hayes, he stood at the exact hinge where a frontier republic became a continental empire. That spring, the Rangers mustered out and rode home to a Texas that was now permanently part of the United States, and that created a strange problem for a man like Hayes.
For 15 years, his whole life had been the frontier war. Comanche and Mexican, one running fight after another, from a granite dome in the hill country to the streets of Mexico City. Now Texas was a state. The U.S. Army had taken over its defense, and the kind of war Jack Hayes was built for was, in Texas, essentially finished. The most famous fighting man on the frontier was, at just 31, a soldier without a war. Men like that did not settle easily. And in 1848, word came east of something that would empty half of Texas and pull Jack Hayes clear across a continent one final time. Gold. In California, the very land he had just helped to conquer. Next episode, the finale. Jack Hayes leaves Texas for good, crosses the deserts he had only ever heard about, and builds an entire second life on the far coast, as a sheriff, a founder of cities, a man who traded the revolver for a ledger. The legend's last chapter, and what became of Devil Jack when the fighting finally stopped. If you've ridden with Jack Hayes this far, subscribe to the Western Ledger and turn on notifications for the finale. I'm Lamar. Thanks for being here.